morning, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Thursday, September 25th. I'm joined by our faithful, hardworking beat correspondent, Andy Anders. Andy, I would ask you how you're doing, but as we're recording this Wednesday night, we just got done waiting out the extra innings of the Reds game, so I feel like I don't even have to ask,
Yeah,
but I
I'm
will.
doing. I'm not.
How
I'm
you
not
doing?
doing the best. I can't lie. Anyone who knows me knows I am a massive Cincinnati fan. I've been a Reds fan since I before I had sentience. Essentially, they went 1 for 10 with runners in scoring position. The most of the hitters forgot how to hit, which has been a major trend this season. Not a fun night to lose the bottom of the 11th to a team that's going to end with 90 losses this season when you're in the thick of a playoff hunt.
Well, my sympathies to you and the Cincinnati Reds. I can imagine the only thing more fun than watching your team lose in extra innings with postseason implications on the line is performance reviews, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today on the 11 Dubcast. But before we get into that, we do want to give a shout out to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio, the official bank of 11 Warriors, and the sponsor of this program, the 11 Dubcast. From game day to workday, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They are locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. Andy, back to the aforementioned performance reviews. I had been planning to talk to you about something you wrote earlier in the week relative to trends going into conference play with this team, but given that I always end up talking to you in the immediate wake of media day, there's usually some interesting nuggets that drop directly from the coaches or the athletic departments themselves. And that once again happened yesterday when we got a nice dropping of you, if you will, of performance reviews from Ross Bjork, the athletic director at Ohio State and the boss of coaches, including one Ryan Day and one Jake Diebler. Now, these were pretty straightforward. The ones that did very well got exceeded expectations. The ones that were a little bit below that, but still doing pretty good, got meet expectations. The Ryan Day one, in terms of exceeded expectations, I would think, I mean, we make the joke all the time that when you're at a place like Ohio State, basically every season feels like national championship or bust. So one could argue that the expectations were actually met, not really succeeded finally within the last season. And any season that they don't win is a disappointment. When you have an unhealthy relationship with this sport as a fan, that's what it can feel like. However, taking a more measured look at this, I can see where Bjork is coming from in terms of saying Ryan Day exceeded expectations. I think there might be a little bit of wiggle room in terms of the lunatic fringe, interpreting that as I don't agree because the guy hasn't beaten Michigan since before the pandemic. How can you possibly say he's exceeding expectations? I would assume that you would agree with where Bjork is coming from relative to Ryan Day, but I'm curious what you thought of the overall report and if you do think there is room for improvement relative to what Bjork's overall assessment of Ryan Day's job has been over the last year and thus far.
I mean, I agree with most of what was said, and Ryan Day, I would agree, has exceeded expectations in the past year. I mean, people, I know some people out there expect Ohio State to win a national title every year. Obviously, this was the first one they'd won in 10 years. It's very hard to win a national championship in this sport to accomplish what they accomplished on the field. But as much as that is, and I know it doesn't enter everyone's mind when you're thinking of a performance review of this nature, when you're thinking of Ohio State football, but it matters what they do off the field too. And Ohio State, there have been the last 2 years, there have been three times where a football team has had a perfect score of 1,000 in academic progress rate, one of the NCAA's main tools for measuring academic success. Those teams were Ohio State, Harvard, and Ohio State. So what they have done in the classroom has been pretty incredible. Based on that, I think that also weighs into exceeding expectations. They've done things in the community. Charity work has always been involved and getting players involved in the community off the field, doing some of those things. The culture, obviously, of the locker room, the family environment that Day has worked to cultivate. These are all things that Bjork pointed to, and I agree with. Of there's more that goes into this when you're a leader of young men. As much as you're a football coach, you're also a leader of young men, than just the football. But also the football was great. So you combine those two things, and I think it's clear to me when you look at this from a measured stance, even as someone who grew up in the Ohio State Michigan rivalry, he exceeded expectations last year.
Yeah, I'm glad that you kept the life perspective overall in terms of the evaluation, because I think it's as lunatic as some of us may be members of the lunatic fringe. It's easy for us to lose that perspective sometimes. That there's more going on here than just the sport. Not all of these guys are going to go forward and play in the NFL. Some of them, you go to university to learn how to become an adult and prepare yourself for the real world and life out there and life after football if you are involved in collegiate athletics. So I think that Day's certainly done a great job of that. I'm especially grateful as somebody that grew up one of the only Ohio State fans in the city of Chicago. It felt like among a horde of Michigan fans, the amount of jokes turning their nose up and looking down upon Ohio State relative to academics that I had to deal with as a kid growing up was quite frustrating in many respects. And to see the about face, I don't know about an about face, but the improvement in that area, particularly among the athletes that the university has seen during my lifetime, and a big part of that has happened within the athletes, the student athletes at the university. And Ryan Day, I think, certainly deserves a lot of credit to that for the trajectory that he's put his team on academically during his time with the Buckeyes. So Ryan Day exceeded expectations. Ross Bjork said Jake Diebler met expectations in his first full season as Ohio State's head coach. Now, I'm sure you've got a very interesting perspective on this, given you are the lead basketball correspondent for 11 Warriors. Diebler, when he was the interim coach, the vibes certainly felt good in terms of kind of taking what was available to him and making the best out of it and nearly catapulting this team into the NCAA tournament. They were an unfortunate game against Illinois in the Big Ten tournament with some here or there officiating, we'll say, from actually making some noise when it looked like they didn't have a shot to do really anything. And that ultimately thrust him into the full-time role the next season and made whoever was really responsible at the time for charging the successor to Chris Holtman made them feel good enough that he could take that on in a full-time role. There were ups and downs last season, to say the least. I know Johnny and I on the Dubcast prior to the pivot, we were quite negative about how things were looking in February relative to the NCAA tournament, when a lot of people felt like Ohio State was not even really a bubble team, that they were pretty firmly going to get in, and then things kind of fell apart at the finish line, and they ended up being one of the last teams, I think, to miss, if not right around that area. So to say that expectations were met, I think, relative to where things were at last season and the optimism that kind of fell out from the bottom, I think most people would agree that seems like a little bit misplaced or stretched to say that with a school that has the resources that Ohio State does, you would expect more. And I think that's interesting relative to what Bjork said about giving Diebler the tools and resources to succeed in tandem with this evaluation. So once again, as I asked you with Day, I'm curious, what were your overall thoughts and perspective on the comments that Bjork had in terms of evaluating the performance of Diebler in this assessment that was released to the public?
Yeah, I have mixed emotions about it, I suppose. As someone who works with Jake, who has received nothing but goodwill from Jake, he's been an excellent coach to work with. I always try to put that aside when evaluating these things. You got to stay measured as a journalist. Talked about staying measured with football and not, and that you also got to be critical when criticism is warranted. And certainly last year didn't meet expectations in terms of what Ohio State basketball should be. They should be an NCAA tournament team every year. I think that's the bare minimum. But the fact is, this program hasn't been there in 4 years. 2 years before Diebler took over, or well, interim coach, they made a run. It wasn't his fault they didn't make the tournament last year, the last year of Holtman when he replaced Holtman at the end of the season. They haven't made the Sweet 16 since in 13 years, I believe, or will be 13 years come this NCAA tournament. The what Ross Bjork said in the report that was very interesting was we all know what he inherited. And so I have this mixed emotion about that saying because yes, Holtman left the program in a really bad place, right? At the same time, this so much of last year's roster was handpicked by Jake, and they hired Jake in part to keep some of the key pieces, Bruce Thornton, Devin Royal, um, keep John Mobley signed with the team coming in as a freshman. These guys, some of those core guys, he was hired in part to keep them on the team. And then you go out and I don't mind taking big swings with guys who were 5-star prospects in high school who flamed out at Blue Bloods, but the Aaron Bradshaw and Sean Stewart experiments flopped hard. Bradshaw more so than Stewart. Um, so to me, it was, I think you'd like to see it be a little below expectations. What I will add as a caveat to that is with these performance reviews, you'll kind of know when you look at the football team, they exceeded expectations. Every single assistant who was there last year was above expectations, and the assistants that were just hired who only like Matt Patricia, Tyler Bowen, who have only been there since the spring, really haven't done much other than some recruiting stuff, implement scheme because this is for the 2024 to 2025 academic year, right? These evaluations cut off when spring ended, when the last school year ended. Those guys also got meets expectations because, like, they couldn't do anything else other than, I guess, like it's hard to have high expectations for a guy that just walked in the door. But uh, I think meets expectations isn't like as Ohio State. I think the standard is to be above expectations, and so maybe like I know this is negotiating things a little bit. It's all semantics, but meets expectations. I don't think is as glowing as people see it as when you just hear those words. I do think there was an acknowledgement from Ross Bjork, from Jake Diebler, that the standard should be an NCAA tournament, and they talked about throwing as many resources as they could behind Jake to get that done. I think that there is another argument to be had that the recruiting the last cycle, 2 cycles coming into this one hasn't been that great either. You just sign Amari Bynum, and that's kind of it for this freshman class. You do get Matthew Grujic from the international ranks, which is an interesting guy. You do get Miles Hero, younger brother of Tyler Hero, as a more developmental piece, but they didn't have much world beaters signed in the recruiting stuff. They did well academically. I think that also factors into it, right? Again, the off the court stuff was good with Jake. Um, but I would say he didn't meet expectations last year. I think that's fair to say because the expectation is the NCAA tournament. Even when first year on the job, um, all that newness and Chris Holtman, what he left the program in shape wise, I think it's fair to say he didn't meet expectations. I can see what Ross Bjork is getting at, and he is a first-year head coach. And just because he didn't meet expectations last year doesn't mean I don't think he can this year. I think they have a real shot to get into the NCAA tournament and take that step as a program. That would be meeting expectations. But to me, I think they fell a little short of that last season, um, even when you consider some of the other positive stuff Jake does in the community. But I also am not one of these people that thought he should have been fired after last year. I guess that's where I'm getting at with it. I think he it's okay to give him another year, give him another shot. Like this is just going to be a very pivotal year for him, and that's a larger discussion. I've talked for a while now about this performance review, but this is a pivotal year for Jake, and I don't think this performance review changes that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I totally understand, and I certainly think between if we're going to call these the two most major coaches in terms of profile that Ohio State has, this was certainly the more interesting and interestingly worded one, especially given the context around Diebler versus Day. The Diebler one certainly is the more interesting one in consideration of all that than the one with Day, from a couple different standpoints. I think that it's, I can appreciate wanting to relay your confidence in someone that you want to give another year to, which is why the comment about we all know what he inherited, I think makes sense. At the same time, I do think that is an interesting comment when you consider the fact that the decision to retain Diebler and promote him from interim to full time was done at a time where Bjork was in the transitory phase of gradually taking over the job from Gene Ross. And so you wonder how much of it was really his entire decision to instill Diebler as the successor as opposed to one that was kind of made in joint consultation with each other, and what that could potentially
I
yield.
do think it was mostly Ross's decision. I'll say
Okay.
that it was clear through the interview process that Ross Bjork was the one conducting the interviews. Gene, at least publicly, said that he was very much serving as much of as an advisor to that and letting Bjork lead the hiring process. Um, Listening that for that introductory press conference with Jake Diebler after he was announced as the full-time head coach last year, Bjork detailed a lot of why he felt that Diebler was the right man for the job. Whether that confidence is misplaced, we'll see. Um, but I do think that it was mostly Bjork's decision,
Okay.
and Gene was more of an advisor in that
All
process.
right. Well, fair enough. I think the other interesting part that we kind of alluded to already was the comment about wanting to give Diebler the resources to succeed, and you're mentioning about kind of the some of the turbulence that the program has hit relative to both recruiting not only high school talent but also making sure that they're hitting on their transfer portal targets. I wonder in this era how realistic it is for a school to thrive at a high level in terms of both camps for football and basketball. I think realistically, unless you've got money dropping out of the sky and growing on trees on campus, it's probably better for you to go for one or the other as opposed to both. Obviously, there's some schools that have already made it work. I think Alabama is probably a pretty good example. It still remains to be seen how they do post Nick Saban relative to football, but basketball, they've certainly been more competitive within the last few years, even through multiple different head coaches than they have been at any other point during my lifetime. They, you can, in theory, make both of them work, but I wonder how much, given we know already goes into football, is kind of left over for basketball to go get their own talent. And we've seen with these last couple of years that they've tried to dedicate a lot in terms of retaining the guys that they do like in house, and then you wonder how much is left over in terms of a salary cap for this team, if you will, that they can then use to go attract new talent into the team to kind of fill out the roster. So, given what Bjork said about giving Diebler the tools to succeed, it'll be interesting to see what else will be available to fill out the roster for Ohio State going forward and if Diebler will be able to capitalize on that. But if you are interested in the nitty gritty of these performance reviews from athletic director Ross Bjork, we do have the full documents written up We have full breakdowns of the documents written up on 11warriors.com. Andy did do the one that Bjork did for Ryan Day. Chase Brown did do the one that Bjork did for Jake Diebler. You can go read those now on 11 Warriors. We also have the full PDF embedded if you want all of the nice details. They're very professionally constructed documents. Beyond the signature page, which is signed in Comic Sans for some reason, which sort of undercuts the message of the whole thing and makes it feel more like an elementary school, parent teacher conference sort of thing, as opposed to an official professional document. But this is from the desk of Ross Bjork himself to his athletic department subordinates in the form of the coaches at The Ohio State University. So plenty of interesting stuff in there if you want to dig into it on 11warriors.com. But Andy, I've kept you long enough. I will leave you to grieve your Cincinnati Reds. My condolences once again. But thank you very much for joining me tonight. We sincerely appreciate your perspective. And thank you for tuning into the 11 Dubcast. We'll be back tomorrow. The first time since we lost Garrick Hodge that Dan is not going to be pulling double duty doing the Tuesday night and Thursday night recordings for the shows this week. I teased you guys yesterday with who the guest is. It is going to be the one and only Ramsey Nasrallah tomorrow to break down the Ohio State-Washington game. So make sure you tune in for that. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the 11 Warriors YouTube channel and the 11 Dubcast. We'll be back tomorrow morning to preview Ohio State-Washington. Make sure you tune in. Take care, folks.